The first thing I tasted was salt, thick and acrid, coating the back of my throat like a layer of industrial grease. It wasn't the refreshing salt of a coastal breeze or the seasoning of a high-end meal. It was the taste of near asphyxiation. I coughed, and the motion was a violent, rib-cracking spasm that forced a slurry of seawater and bile out of my lungs and onto the sand. My eyes burned as I opened them, the midday sun striking the retinas with the force of a physical blow. I rolled onto my side, my cheek dragging against the coarse, abrasive grains of a beach that didn't belong to any world I knew. I didn't move for a long time. I just breathed. Every inhale felt like drawing air through a wet wool blanket. My ribs screamed, likely cracked, certainly bruised, and my left arm was a mapping of dull, pulsating heat. I looked down at myself. I was a ruin. My shirt, once a crisp, breathable linen, was reduced to damp, translucent rags that clung to my torso like a second flayed skin. My pants were shredded at the knees. And then there were the shoes. I looked at my feet and felt a hysterical, misplaced surge of grief. My gray leather monk strap buckle loafers, hand-burnished, Italian-made, the kind of footwear that signaled a specific tier of success, were destroyed. The salt water had bloated the leather, turning the elegant slate gray into a sickly, mottled charcoal. One buckle was bent back at an impossible angle. The other was gone entirely, leaving a jagged strip of torn hide. They were expensive, useless weights now, the soles beginning to delaminate for the welt. They were a metaphor for the yacht, high performance, aesthetically perfect and utterly obliterated by the raw, indifferent physics of the ocean. And then I called her name, Sally. The word was a rasp, barely audible over the rhythmic, mechanical thrash of the surf. I tried again, louder. No answer. Only the sound of the water retreating over the shingle, a sound like 1,000 tiny glass beads being shaken in a jar. I forced myself up. The world tilted, the horizon line performing a nauseating pirouette before settling into a jagged, shimmering line. I was on a crescent-shaped beach, perhaps 2 miles long, bookended by massive outcroppings of volcanic rock that looked like the charred teeth of some subterranean god. The storm, the thing that had taken the yacht, was gone, replaced by a sky so blue it looked artificial, a piercing, predatory azure. I scanned the shoreline. Pieces of the Alethea were scattered like confetti across the sand. A section of the fiberglass hull, jagged and white, a tangle of yellow nylon rope. A sodden cushion from the stern lounge. I saw a splintered piece of the teak decking, the wood that Sally had insisted we oil every month. I began to walk. The 2-mile stretch of sand became a gauntlet. Every step in the monk straps was an exercise in friction and pain. The sand entered the shoes, acting like sandpaper against the water-softened flesh of my heels and toes. I could feel the blisters forming, then popping, then the raw sting of the salt water entering the new wounds. I didn't take them off. The sand was blistering hot, and the debris, shards of carbon fiber and glass from the wreck, was everywhere. I walked the entire length of the beach, from a northern rock wall to the southern point. I checked behind every piece of driftwood, every clump of tangled kelp. I looked into the tidal pools, dreading the sight of a pale limb or a mass of blonde hair swaying in the current. There was nothing but the wreckage of the boat and the indifferent debris of the sea. I sat down on a piece of the Alethea's mast, my breath coming in ragged hitches. I'm a man who deals in certainties. I deal in logistics, in the measurable, in the cold calculus of risk and reward. My mind began to process the data, whether I wanted it to or not. Fact, the storm hit at approximately 0200 hours. Fact, the yacht's last known coordinates were nowhere near any charted landmass in this sector of the Pacific. Fact, Sally is a strong swimmer, but the kinetic energy of a breaking wave in a force 10 gale is enough to crush a human skull against a bulkhead before they even hit the water. Fact, I am alive. Therefore, the possibility exists that she is too. I looked at the water. If she had drowned, the current would likely have brought her here or swept her out to the deep. If she had survived, she wouldn't stay on the beach. Sally was an architect, not just by trade, but by temperament. She built structures. She sought order. She was the smartest person I had ever known, possessing a pragmatic, survivalist streak that she usually hid behind a veil of urban sophistication. She would know that the beach offered no shade, no fresh water, and no protection. I looked toward the interior of the island. The beach gave way to a dense, impenetrable wall of green. This wasn't the manicured tropical paradise of a resort. It was a chaotic, violent explosion of flora. Beyond the initial line of palms, the land rose sharply toward a central spine of volcanic peaks. If Sally were alive, she'd head for the center. She'd look for high ground to survey the island, or for the drainage basins where fresh water might collect. She wouldn't wait for a rescue that might never come. She would move toward the heart of the problem. I stood up, my legs trembling. The sun was beginning its descent, drifting toward the western horizon in a blaze of orange and bruised purple. The light was changing, losing its clarity, becoming long and deceptive. I had to move. I turned my back on the ocean and the ruins of my life and walked toward the tree line. The transition from the beach to the forest was like stepping into a different dimension. The heat on the sand had been dry and radiant. Here, it was heavy, a physical weight that smelled of damp earth and rotting cellulose. The sound of the surf was immediately muffled, replaced by a wall of noise that made my skin crawl. The buzzing of insects was a constant, high-pitched drone, punctuated by the sudden, sharp cries of birds I couldn't see, harsh shrieks that sounded more like threats than songs. I pushed through a thicket of dwarf palms, their fronds scratching at the raw skin of my arms. The ground under my monk straps changed. The soft, forgiving sand gave way to a treacherous mixture of loose dirt, decaying leaves, and sharp, volcanic rock. My shoes were failing rapidly. The leather was drying in the humidity, shrinking and stiffening, the edges cutting into my ankles like blunt saws. I stumbled over a protruding root, my hands flying out to catch myself. I grabbed a handful of something thorny, and I felt the sharp prick of dozens of tiny needles. I pulled my hand back, hissing. Small beads of dark blood welled up on my palm. I wiped them on my torn pants and kept moving. I had to be rational. I couldn't let the unsettling nature of this place get to me. I began to analyze the island's absence from my charts. The Alethea was equipped with the latest garment suite, updated monthly. For an island of this size, it had to be at least 10 or 15 miles across. To be missing from digital and paper charts was a statistical impossibility, unless it was intentional. The thought didn't bring comfort. If an island is missing from the maps, it's usually because someone with a lot of power wants it that way. Secure research facilities, weapons testing ranges, private black sites. I looked at the trees around me, half expecting to see a camera lens hidden in the bark or a motion sensor tucked among the ferns. But there was nothing but the raw, unfiltered, overpowering sense of nature. The terrain began to slope upward. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. Dehydration was starting to set in. My tongue felt like a piece of dry leather in my mouth, and a dull ache was blossoming behind my eyes. I needed water, but more than that, I needed a vantage point. The light was failing fast now. In the tropics, the sun doesn't linger. It drops like a stone. The shadows in the forest were stretching, merging into a single, bruised darkness. The green of the leaves was turning to a murky gray, then black. I pushed further, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every few minutes, I would stop and yell her name. But to no avail. The forest swallowed the sound. There was no echo, only the immediate dampening of my voice by the heavy air and the thick foliage. The insects seemed to get louder in response, a mocking, rhythmic thrumming. I reached a small clearing where the canopy had thinned slightly. To my left, a massive banyan tree had dropped its aerial roots into the soil, creating a cage of wood. To my right, the ground fell away into a steep, dark ravine. I could hear the sound of water, a trickling, mocking sound, somewhere at the bottom, but the descent was too steep and the light was too far gone. If I tried to climb down there now, I'd break a leg. And on this island, a broken leg was a death sentence. I leaned against a smooth, wind-worn rock that jutted out from the hillside. I was exhausted. Not the long day at the office exhaustion, but a profound cellular depletion. My muscles were twitching involuntarily, and the adrenaline that had carried me since the beach was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, hollow dread. The sun was gone. The sky above the canopy was a deep, ink-wash violet, and the first stars were beginning to prick through burning, cold points of light that offered no warmth. I had to stop. I knew the rule. You don't travel in the jungle at night. You don't know where you're putting your feet. You don't know what's waking up. I looked at the rock I was leaning against. It was large, flat-topped, and relatively dry. It sat under a slight overhang of the hillside, providing a modicum of protection from any sudden rain. This is it, I thought. I began to gather materials. I moved with a sluggish, heavy-limbed deliberation. I found several large palm branches that had fallen nearby, their fronds dry and brittle. I dragged them over to the rock, layering them to create a crude barrier against the wind and the damp earth. Anything was better than being exposed to the elements. I sat down on the rock, leaning my back against the cold stone. I pulled my legs up to my chest, trying to conserve heat. The monk straps were a disaster. I finally unbuckled the remaining strap and eased my feet out of them. The relief was instantaneous but brief, replaced quickly by the stinging reality of the air hitting the raw sores. My feet were white, wrinkled, and bloodied. The forest changed at night. The birds went silent, but the void was filled by something much more unsettling. The insects didn't just buzz, they vibrated. It was a sound that felt like it was happening inside my skull, a tectonic grinding of millions of chitinous bodies. And then there were the bats. I heard them before I saw them, a high-pitched screeching that seemed to bounce off the trees. Then I saw the silhouettes, dark, jagged shapes flitting across the small patch of sky visible through the canopy. They weren't like the small brown bats I'd seen in the States. These were larger, their wingspans wide and silent, their movements erratic and predatory. They swooped low, the sound of their leathery wings a sudden whomp-whomp in the darkness. I pulled the palm branches closer around me, trying to disappear into the shadows of the rock. The unfiltered nature of my reality began to settle in. I was a man who lived in a world of filters. High-efficiency air filters in my office, blue light filters on my screens, the social filters of wealth and etiquette that kept the jagged edges of life at a distance. All of that was gone. There was no glass between me and the world anymore. I thought about Sally. I pictured her in the darkness, perhaps doing exactly what I was doing. Or perhaps she was already dead, her body snagged on a reef or sinking into the anaerobic silence of the deep ocean. No, I couldn't go there. If I went there, I wouldn't get up in the morning. The intelligence that had served me throughout my business lifestyle, whether it was in boardroom meetings or at our country club dinners, began to turn on itself. I started to calculate the odds of rescue. If the yacht's emergency position indicating radio beacon had triggered, the signal would have gone to a satellite. But the storm was massive, a localized atmospheric collapse. Had the signal gotten through? And even if it had, how long would it take for a Coast Guard cutter or a passing freighter to reach these coordinates? Coordinates that didn't technically exist on their maps. And then there was the island itself. The secret government theory wasn't just panic. It was a deduction based on the absence of data. But if it was a restricted site, would a rescue even be a rescue? Or would it be an extraction, an interrogation? The insect grew louder, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to sync with the throbbing of my wounds. Something scurried across the leaves near my feet, something with too many legs. I didn't move. I couldn't see it, and in the dark, the imagination is a far crueler predator than anything with a physical form. I thought about the night before the storm. We had been on the deck, drinking a Sancerre that was perhaps a bit too chilled. Sally had been talking about the Fibonacci sequence in the growth patterns of coral. She was leaning back, her hair caught in the wind, her eyes bright with the intellectual curiosity that was her defining trait. "Everything has a logic, Elias," she had said, clinking her glass against mine. even the chaos. We just have to be smart enough to see the pattern. I close my eyes, trying to find the pattern in the screeching of the bats and the grinding of the insects. The cold began to seep in. It wasn't a freezing cold, but a damp, parasitic chill that moved from the stone into my bones. My torn shirt provided no insulation. I huddled deeper into the palm fronds, the dry edges poking at my neck. I didn't sleep, not really. I hovered in that gray space between consciousness and delirium. Every time I started to drift, a new sound would jerk me back. A heavy thud in the undergrowth, a particularly loud screech from above, the sensation of something crawling across my ankle. I was Elias Thorne. I was a man of means, a man of intellect, a man of the modern world. And yet, here I was, huddled on a rock like a primitive ancestor, shivering in the ruins of my expensive clothes, waiting for a sun that felt like it would never rise again. The intelligence of a human mind is a double-edged sword. It allows us to build yachts and navigate the stars, but it also allows us to fully comprehend the scale of our own insignificance. On that beach, I was a survivor. In this forest, in the dark, I was vulnerable and afraid. The bats continued their frantic, invisible dance. The insects maintained their mechanical hum. I stared into the blackness, my hand resting on the cold, ruined leather of my shoe, and I waited. I waited for the light, for the pattern, for the first sign that the world I knew still existed. But for now, there was only the dark, the salt, and the unsettling sound of a world that didn't care if I lived to see the morning. Hour after hour, the night pressed down. My thoughts became a jagged loop, a carousel of anxieties and calculations. I began to deconstruct this center of the island theory. Why did I think she'd go there? Was it a genuine deduction? Or was I simply projecting my own need for a destination? If I were her, and I had washed up on a strange shore, what would I do? I'd assess the horizon. I'd realize the beach was a trap. I'd look for the highest point of visibility. She would think the same. She'd want to see the shape of the land. She'd want to know if there was smoke on the horizon or a structure on a peak. But what if she couldn't walk? What if she was pinned under a piece of the hull, 5 miles back down the coast in a section I hadn't seen? No, I had checked the 2-mile stretch. I had been thorough. The unfiltered reality was that I was guessing. I was moving based on an idealized version of her, a version that was always rational, always capable. I had to consider the alternative, that she was gone, and I was chasing a ghost into the heart of a nameless jungle. I shifted my weight, and the rock beneath me felt like it was growing teeth. My hip was a dull ache. My ribs felt like they were being squeezed in a slow-motion vise. I reached out and touched the banyan tree roots near the rock. They were cold and damp, feeling more like petrified flesh than wood. I began to think about the yacht's name again. Aletheia. It was the Greek word for truth or unconcealment. Sally had chosen it. She said that being on the ocean was the only time she felt the world wasn't lying to her. Out there, the wind and the waves didn't have an agenda. They were just true. Well, I was getting the truth now. The truth was that the gray monkstrap loafers were a vanity. The truth was that my wealth was a series of numbers on a flickering screen that meant absolutely nothing to the insects eating my skin. The truth was that I was a biological entity in a hostile environment, and the only thing that mattered was the next breath. I felt a sudden, sharp sting on my neck. I slapped at it, my hand coming away with a smear of something wet and a crushed, hard-shell body. I wiped my hand on the rock, a surge of pure, animal disgust rising in my throat. The bats seemed to be congregating in the clearing now. Their screeches were more frequent, a cacophony of high-frequency pings. I could hear them landing in the trees, the sound of claws scratching on bark, the rustle of leaves as they folded their wings. They were watching, or maybe they were just waiting for the insects to settle. I tried to focus on my breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The box breathing technique I'd learned during a high-stress management seminar. It seemed absurd now, a corporate tool used in a primitive struggle, but it was the only piece of my old life that still functioned. I thought about the map. I closed my eyes and tried to visualize the charts of this sector. There was nothing. Just a vast blue emptiness between the Marquesas and the Pitcairn Islands. How could an island this size, with peaks that had to be at least 1,000 feet high, go unnoticed? Volcanic activity? A new island? No, the trees were too old. The banyan tree next to me had to be centuries old. Maybe the government testing theory was the most intelligent one because it was the only one that accounted for the omission. But what would they test here? Chemicals? Biological agents? I looked at the smear of the insect on the rock. Was it natural? Or was it something else? I was spiraling. I knew I was spiraling. Isolation and trauma do that to a mind. They turn logic into a conspiracy. I forced myself to stop. It didn't matter why the island wasn't on the map. It only mattered that it was here, and I was on it. I looked up through the canopy again. The violet sky had turned to a deep, bruised black. The stars were brilliant in different diamonds. I wondered if Sally was looking at the same stars. I wondered if she was cold. I wondered if she was scared. Sally was never scared. Not in the way I was. She had a way of looking at a crisis as a series of structural failures that could be reinforced. She'd be looking for a way to reinforce her situation. She'd be building a fire or finding a way to catch rainwater. I hadn't even thought about fire. I didn't have a lighter. My matches were in a waterproof tin on the boat, which was now likely at the bottom of the Pacific. I didn't know how to rub sticks together. I was a man who could navigate a complex merger, but I couldn't create light. The realization was a visceral blow. I was helpless. I leaned my head back against the rock and closed my eyes. The sound of the jungle was a roar now, a symphony of predation and survival. The insects, the bats, the rustling in the underbrush, it was all one thing. It was the sound of life continuing without me. I thought about the loafers again. Why had I worn them? We were on a yacht. I should have been in deck shoes or barefoot. But we were planning to pull into a private cove for dinner, and I wanted to look the part. I wanted to be the man who owned the Alethea. I wanted to be the man who deserved a woman like Sally. Now the shoes were just a reminder of who I wasn't anymore. I felt a wave of exhaustion so profound that it overrode the pain and the fear. My body was shutting down, forcing me into a state of semi-consciousness. I huddled under the palm fronds, their dry, dusty smell filling my nostrils. The bats continued to shriek. The insects continued to grind. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a loud crack. A falling branch, or perhaps something larger moving through the forest. I didn't open my eyes. I couldn't. Just a few hours, I told myself. Just until the light. As I drifted, my mind played a final cruel trick. I imagined I heard her voice. Not screaming, not calling for help, but just talking the way she did when she was working on a blueprint. The foundation is everything, Elias. If the foundation is solid, the rest can be rebuilt. I clung to that thought as the darkness of the island swallowed me whole. I lay on the rock, a broken man in ruined clothes, surrounded by an indifferent wilderness, and I waited for the dawn to show me the truth of what was left. The insects crawled, the bats flew, and I, for the first time in my life, simply existed, a small, silent pulse in the vast, unmapped heart of the world. My eyes opened to a gray, pre-dawn light that filtered through the jungle canopy. The transition from the feverish humidity of the jungle night to the immediate, biting sting of the hot jungle morning was a hell of a wake-up call. My body felt as though it had been put through a wood chipper. Every joint, from my ankles to the base of my skull, throbbed with a rhythmic, pulsing ache. I lay there for a long moment, staring at the sky, waiting for the nausea to subside. The shifting of the canopy jungle began its morning chorus. The screeching of bats, which had not made the night any easier throughout the fitful fragments of sleep I'd managed, had been replaced by the rhythmic, cawing of native tropical birds I didn't recognize. I pushed myself up, wincing as my shoulder protested. I looked down at my feet, my swollen, blistered soles totally susceptible and really feeling the cold, damp earth. How had this all happened so suddenly? I was a man who had been sipping champagne on the deck of a yacht 48 hours ago with my true love, and now I'm battered and bruised alone in an unknown and possible hostile environment with my girlfriend possibly dead or worse, alone. I stood, steadying myself against the rock that had served as my pillow, and began moving. The jungle did not want me there. It was a dense, claustrophobic labyrinth of aggressive flora. Every step was a negotiation. I moved with a deliberate, low-energy gait, saving what little stores of glycogen I had left. My mind was a serrated blade, cutting through the panic to focus on the logistics of survival. If Sally reached the shore, I reasoned, she wouldn't head toward the coastline. She's too rational for that. She would seek high ground to survey the geography, to identify the source of the storm's wake, or to find a way to signal for help. She would go inland. The forest grew denser, the air thickening with the smell of wet loam and rotting vegetation. I was perhaps 30 minutes into the trek, my concentration waning when my right foot nudged something that didn't feel like a root. It moved. I froze. A dark, sinewy length of muscle retreated into the undergrowth with fluid, terrifying grace. A serpent, its scales shimmering with a sickly iridescence in the dappled light. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. God damn it. I breathed, my breath hitching, a cold sweat breaking across my forehead despite the stagnant heat. I hate snakes. I took a wide, shaky berth around the spot, my eyes scanning the ground with newfound paranoia. The psychological toll of the island was beginning to mount. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion. It was the isolation, the crushing weight of the unknown. Was this an uncharted landmass? Or was I a ghost wandering in a place that didn't appear on any nautical chart for a reason? As I pushed through a final thicket of broadleaf plants, the texture of the ground changed. The soft, spongy earth grew firm. I looked up. Through a gap in the canopy, I saw the jagged spine of a mountain range, blue-gray and imposing against the brightening sky. And then, the forest floor gave way to something unnatural. A gravel road. It didn't look like a trail cleared by goats or local woodcutters. It was wide, engineered, and maintained. My mind raced through a dozen permutations. A resort? A research outpost? A government site? The idea of a clandestine facility didn't feel as paranoid as it had the day before. On the open ocean, the world was a map. Here, it was a closed room. I stepped on the gravel, the sharp stones biting into my already ruined feet. I didn't care. I followed the road, my pace picking up in spite of the pain. The curve of the mountain obscured what lay ahead, but the promise of human intervention, for better or worse, drove me forward. The road bent, hugging the contour of the slope. I rounded the corner and stopped dead. The structures were industrial, jarringly so. A high-tensile steel fence, nearly 20 feet tall, stretched out as far as the eye could see in both directions, disappearing into the dense, encroaching jungle. At its base, a stream ran parallel, a vein of clear water cutting through the harsh, man-made barrier. My mouth was a desert. I didn't care about the source of the water or the potential for contamination. I dropped to my knees, dipping my cupped hands into the stream. The water was icy, metallic, and tasted of stone. It was the best thing I had ever consumed. I drank until my stomach felt heavy, then leaned back against the embankment, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. I stood and approached the gate. It was a classic man-trap. A double-doored vehicle passed through. The steel was gray and coated in a dull, weather-resistant paint. Bolted to the metal were yellow warning plates. Danger, 10,000 volts. A stylized silhouette of a hand caught in a bolt of lightning served as a stark, universal warning. My breath caught. Electrified? The sheer audacity of such security in this remote corner of the earth defied logic. Why fortify a perimeter so aggressively if the island was supposed to be a secret? I looked at the gate. It was partially open, a narrow gap, perhaps 6 inches wide, suggesting the inner mechanism was jammed or the power had been cut. Or perhaps it had been forced. I picked up a thick branch from the roadside, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm in my ears. I didn't think. I just acted, thrusting the wood into the electrified wiring of the gate frame. I braced for a shower of sparks, a crack of ozone, a violent discharge. Nothing. The wood hung there inert. The fence was dead. My shoulders sagged with a mix of relief and a new wave of apprehension. Great for me in the immediate sense. I wouldn't be electrocuted. But it also meant whatever was being kept on the other side of that 20-foot-high fence was now able to access wherever they wanted. The implications were chilling. But what was I thinking? An active facility wouldn't leave a 10,000-volt perimeter fence unpowered and its entry gates wide open. This suggested either abandonment, a critical failure, or some calculated, deliberate act. None of those scenarios boded well. My feet still screamed. My body was a tapestry of pain. But the thirst was gone, at least for now. And ahead of me, a path lay open. A path through a gate that should have been locked, but was instead inert and inviting. Sally, I whispered again, the name a silent prayer as I stepped into the metal box of the pass-through. The concrete underfoot was smoother than the gravel, a momentary reprieve for my feet. The metal walls of the box rose on either side, casting long, stark shadows. It felt like walking into a cage. There was no going back now. The thought of turning around, of re-entering the featureless jungle, was unbearable. This road, however menacing, held the promise of answers, of a direction. I was on the other side now. The world shifted. What did I expect to find? A guard post? A deserted research complex? A clearing filled with alien technology? My mind raced, trying to preempt, to prepare for the utterly unpredictable. All I knew was that I had crossed a threshold, physically and psychologically. I was no longer just a shipwrecked survivor. I was an intruder, and every fiber of my being, every aching muscle and blistered nerve, was focused on one singular, desperate mission: find Sally. Whatever lay beyond this gate, whatever strange, unsettling truth this island held, it was now my reality. And I had to face it, one excruciating, hopeful step at a time. I took a deep breath, the humid, dry air filling my lungs. The air on this side of the gate felt different somehow. Heavier, more expectant. The sounds of the jungle, though still present, seemed to recede, replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible hum of absence. I moved with a rhythmic, limping cadence, trying to keep my weight on the outer edges of my feet. The jungle hemmed me in, a wall of claustrophobic, hypersaturated greenery that smelled of rot, wet soil, and something sharp like ozone or ozone-adjacent chemical runoff. And then I heard what sounded like soft, distant trumpet calls. That's not a bird, I thought. It sounded like some sort of animal or animals. They were too resonant, too deep to be avian. They vibrated in the hollow of my chest. Long, mournful, brassy blasts that sounded like trumpets played through a throat the size of an oil drum. They were coming from miles away, perhaps deeper in the interior. Logic, I muttered to myself. My voice sounded thin, alien in the heavy stillness of the trees. Establish a baseline. If this were a standard tropical island, the ecology would be manageable. If this were a military installation, there would be patrols. But the silence here was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb, broken only by the chaotic, discordant chittering of insects that seemed to be communicating in frequencies that made the hair on my forearms stand up. And then out of nowhere, as though all my stars had aligned, I saw a vehicle. It was sitting at an odd angle near a bend in the road, its chassis resting low. The paint job was the first thing that hit me, a deliberate, almost mocking aesthetic. It was sand beige on the passenger door. A decal of a dinosaur skeleton stared back at me, its fossilized jaw frozen in a permanent, silent roar. I approached it with a wariness that felt brittle. There was no blood on the upholstery, no signs of a struggle. Just an abandoned vehicle left to the slow digestion of the humidity. The doors were unlocked. I pulled the driver's side open, the hinges screaming a protest that seemed deafening in the quiet. I checked the dashboard. The needle rested on empty. The ignition was cold, but on the passenger seat, tucked into a leather pouch, I found a single-shot flare gun. Heavy, industrial, and reassuringly solid. I broke it open, empty. I checked the small side pocket of the bag. 3 shells, Red plastic, brass ends oxidized. I took them. I tucked the flare gun into the back of my waistband and shoved the shells into my pocket. Beside the bag was a flashlight. I clicked it on. A firm, LED beam that cut through the dappled sunlight. It was a small mercy, but in this place, a mercy felt like a trap. I kept moving. The gravel road eventually widened, and after what seemed 20 or so minutes, the trees gave way to an opening with a large pond, and I stopped. Opposite the large pond was a building, like a fever dream of mid-century modernism and tropical kitsch. It was gargantuan, a two-story sprawl of white concrete that hummed with a strange, architectural arrogance. The central section was topped with a massive, thatch cone roof, balanced by smaller, symmetrical cones on either side. It was a resort aesthetic, but it felt sterile. The lower level featured a concave curve that drew the eye inward, leading to a set of flowing water ducts. Above that, the building bowed out, a convex swell that looked almost pregnant. A set of stairs, wide and imposing, cut the building in half, leading up to double wooden doors with engravings. The building looked still under partial construction. Engraved into the stone lintel above the entrance were faux dinosaur fossils, a decorative flourish that made me nauseated. I stood at the base of the stairs, my legs shaking. The pond system behind me was a sprawling, artificial river that snaked through the valley, its water dark and still. I looked at the set of double doors. I had to know. I had to go inside to find a phone or a map to Sally. I climbed the stairs, the stone biting into my bare soles. My exhaustion was a physical weight now, a heavy wool blanket draped over my shoulders. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I grabbed the handle. Locked. I pressed my weight against it, shoved, and heard the familiar metallic groan of a latch failing. It didn't open fully, snagging on something, but it gave me a gap. I leaned my forehead against the door, peering into the gloom of the lobby.